On January 6th, we watched hordes of Donald Trump supporters storm the Capitol, many who came prepared for battle, with weapons, zip-tie handcuffs, and chanting things like "Hang Mike Pence." We saw a video of rioters crushing police officers, dragging them down the Capitol steps and beating them with flags, all of it done in Trump's name shortly after he told them to fight like hell. But now, as he contemplates another White House bid in 2024, former president is trying to rewrite that history.
It was a zero threat. Right from the start, it was zero threat. Look, they went in. They shouldn't have done it. Some of them went in and they're hugging and kissing the police and the guards. You know, they had great relationships.
Like with the late Capitol officer Brian Sicknick, you mean, Mr. President? This is just the latest in a web of lies from Donald Trump, all built around one big one, that the election was stolen from him, and that many of the ballots behind Joe Biden's win were somehow illegitimate. And now Republican allies of the former president are using that lie to try and pass hundreds of election law changes in states across the country that would make it harder for low-income and people of color to vote. One such bill was just signed into law in Georgia, where a surge in black voters flipped the state blue, putting Democrats in control of the White House and the Senate. It's called SB 202. And among other things, it gives state officials the power to overrule county election boards and potentially disqualify voters. It also requires ID for absentee ballots, limits the placement of ballot drop boxes, and in a state where lines outside of polling places already often stretch on for blocks in largely non-white areas, it makes it a crime to bring food and water to voters waiting in line. In response to criticism, Georgia Governor Brian Kemp argued the changes are necessary to keep the state's elections secure.
My commitment to the people of our state is simple. I will not back down. The truth is, ensuring the integrity of the ballot box isn't partisan. It's about protecting the very foundation of who we are as Georgians and Americans.
But critics say it's not about security, it's about suppression. And shortly after the bill was filed, voting rights and engagement groups Rise Inc., the New Georgia Project, and Black Voters Matter Fund filed a legal challenge, arguing the law is, quote, clearly intended to and will have the effect of making it harder for lawful Georgia voters to participate in the state's elections. It will impose these unjustified burdens disproportionately on the state's minority, young, poor, and disabled citizens. And just yesterday, on behalf of another group of organizations, the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law filed a second suit in it they argue unable to stem the tide of these demographic changes or change the voting patterns of voters of color. These officials have resorted to attempting to suppress the vote of black voters and other voters of color in order to maintain the tenuous hold the Republican Party has in Georgia. I'm joined by LaTosha Brown. She's the co-founder of Black Voters Matter Fund and the acting president and executive director of the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law, Damon Hewitt. LaTosha, great to see you. Damon, good to meet you. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
LaTosha, if I can start with you, if this law had been in effect last year, before the elections, would Reverend Warnock and John Ossoff be in the United States Senate?
Yeah, I think that I don't think so. I think we would have, particularly the most egregious part of which you raised, where the GOP would have had the opportunity to take over the state board of elections, which is essentially what Trump wanted. What's really interesting is in a state like Georgia, you know, let's be mindful, Georgia was the state that we saw voter suppression in 2018. We fast forward to 2020, and this is the very state that the president called the Secretary of State and said to fine, can't you fine me thousands of votes? And so, like, this is a state that the Republicans had control of the Senate, the House, and the governor's office, which essentially, when you're talking about the oversight of the election, the Republicans had oversight of the election. And it wasn't as if voter suppression didn't exist in this last election cycle. We just simply out-organized them in a way that we were able to overwhelm. We had the numbers of people that came out, that cast their votes, citizens in this state that cast their votes, that they weren't expecting, that actually we got a different outcome. And so now, here it is, an election that the Republicans were in charge of. Now they're saying that there was something wrong, even though there was a vote that literally 3 times it was counted, that they recounted 3 times, and there was no broad spectrum of fraud found at whatsoever.
You know, Damon, I read part of your statement that was released when you filed the litigation. You speak of, as did the litigation that LaTosha's group is involved in, a disproportionate impact, negative impact, obviously, on voters of color. Make the case as to why that impact will be greater on voters of color than, say, white voters in Georgia.
Well, Jim, look, when you look at where people need access to multiple means of voting, when you look at what the long lines always are, when you look at people who stand up for each other and help each other out when they're in those long lines, essentially what's happening is this is designed to hurt the folks, communities of color, who are frankly finding ways to make a way to vote, to have their voices heard and make sure their ballots are cast. And so it's really designed to really undercut all those efforts, whether it be souls to the polls, which was certainly obviously part of the early iterations of the legislation, or just helping people to be able to sustain these really long, unsufferable lines. The idea is that, look, all kinds of people are in the lines, but it's predominantly in your black and brown communities, communities of color, poorer communities as well, where you see the lack of infrastructure in terms of voting apparatus.
You know, LaTosha, you have to explain something to me, if you will. Following the murder of George Floyd, major corporations across this country were falling over each other to get it to the front of the line to demand a racial reckoning, greater racial equity in this country. But come this law in Georgia, it seems that they had some, maybe body doubles have replaced them or something. Places like Delta, Coca-Cola, have headquarters there. Let me read you part of the statement from Delta. Delta believes that full and equal access to voting is a fundamental right. The legislation signed this week improved considerably during the legislative process, expands weekend voting, codifies Sunday voting, protects the voter's ability to cast an absentee ballot without providing a reason. Nonetheless, we understand concerns remain over other provisions in the legislation, et cetera, et cetera. What happened to these people?
You know, it's really interesting. I think that when we're talking about racial equity, what we see is that those were empty words, that there was no real commitment behind that. This is actually low-hanging fruit. This is an issue that shouldn't be partisan. We're allowing the Republicans, we're allowing the Republicans to make something as fundamental as access to the ballot to become a partisan issue, right? Regardless of who is in office, my right to vote should be protected and should be respected. And so what we're seeing is these companies that came out, as you said, with these racial equity statements, there was no real commitment behind them. A company like Delta Airlines in particular, that 46% of their workforce are people of color. A company like Delta that is based here, that has been a homegrown company, that has received support from the city of Atlanta, the county, and as a state. And to actually do what I call is the racist spin, the spin that we've seen throughout history, that actually when we're seeing very damaging racist legislation that is actually repackaged in the name of, oh, this is to help black voters. This is to expand the vote. And so for Delta to align itself with that message is not only appalling, it's disrespectful.
By the way, and for people who don't think that matters, when corporations found a spine in North Carolina a few years ago after the so-called bathroom bill, the legislature repealed it because they knew what power those businesses had. Damon, going back to you and your litigation, the federal judiciary was in great part remade by Donald Trump. I don't hold much hope out there. The Supreme Court was remade in the image of Donald Trump. I feel the same way there. And Joe Biden said the other day, the Department of Justice is going to look at this. I don't know exactly what it is they can do. Do you have more faith in the federal judiciary coming up with a just outcome here than I do?
Well, what I have faith in are the people on the ground, like LaTosha and others. I have faith in communities. And look, we have to move on every avenue, to use all the tools in our toolkit. It's not just organizing. It's certainly not just litigation, although I think calling this intentional discrimination and trying to prove it in court is important, and that's exactly what we're doing. But look, this is Exhibit A, Jim, as to why we need federal legislation. why we need not just the For the People Act for the basics of voting apparatus and infrastructure, but we also need the John Lewis Act as well to really restore Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, because if we had that in place, the pre-clearance provision that the Supreme Court gutted in the Shelby County decision several years ago, all of this you see in Georgia and nationwide would have been stopped in its tracks in so many jurisdictions around the country.
And remember, in that case, John Roberts was a swing vote. He appears not to have enough power to be a swing vote now, so it is in the hands of Congress. I want to broach with you both, if I may, just a couple of the legal issues. I want to show you a video, LaTosha, I think all of America has seen repeatedly. This is State Representative Park Cannon being arrested while Governor Kemp is inside his office signing this bill into law. Here's a little bit of that.
Yeah, you said you give her one more time, like you're going to do something. Are you serious?
No, you are not. Represent.
She's not under arrest.
For what? Under arrest for what? For trying to see something that our governor is doing?
What crime did Representative Cannon commit there, LaTosha?
She's a black woman in a racist state where what we're seeing, we're currently, there are leaders in this state who have aligned themselves with a racist agenda. The bottom line is, if you see that image and you juxtapose that to the other image of the signing of the bill, here's a state that you're seeing, a state that you're seeing a white male sitting up under a picture of a plantation, a notorious plantation in the state of Georgia, has a notorious history, right, and flanked by 6 white men. That is not reflective of who makes up the state of Georgia. And so to actually see that, and to see that this woman was manhandled by the state troopers, and she's a duly elected official that was knocking on the door, and the governor, who should not have been having a private locked up in his office to sign a public bill, you know, that whole, it is an atrocity of something that I've not seen, but it is very symbolic what I think is happening in this country. You know, I think that as a black woman, I think black women have been on the front line and on the vanguard of standing and fighting for democracy and asking for accountability. And I think that's what you saw in that, and in many ways that we have been attacked. Our bodies have been attacked, like politically we have been attacked. So that's what we're seeing. So if you just put those images about what was on one side of the room and the other side of the room, it actually, I think, is symbolic of what is happening right now of democracy in this country and who is actually standing in the gap fighting for accountability and for democracy.
Damon, I just have a couple of seconds, but one other possible criminal prosecution in Georgia, Fannie Willis, relatively new county DA, I think in Fulton County, apparently is beefing up her troops in her investigation of whether Donald Trump, in that phone call that was referenced by LaTosha, where he asked the Secretary of State to find 11,780 votes. It seems to me, from several 1,000+ miles away, that she's gearing up for a prosecution. Is that a fair analysis from afar?
Well, it's at least an investigation. And so it's, you know, it's about time that the apparatus started to work on behalf of justice in communities whose voices and votes and very vitality are trying to be stripped away from them. So we don't know exactly what's going to happen there, but I think going back to what LaTosha said is right. You know, you juxtapose how apparatus of law enforcement gets used against black bodies, these black women in particular who are on the front lines from Fannie Lou Hamer on to today, and you look at that, compare it to what happened on January 6th, how some of the rioters were welcomed in, right? So that juxtaposition is the inherent divide in our democracy, and it's time to fix that. Once and for all, at least try to do it on our watch.
15 seconds, LaTosha. You're one of the most relentless people I've ever met in my whole life. I assume you still hold out hope that this legislature could be forced to repeal this thing. Is that a fair statement?
It is. You know, I think that people, I continue to say what I do believe in the Constitution is we the people. That, you know, when I've been at the protests, when I've been at the meetings, I've seen a broad base, a multiracial, multi-generational coalition of people who are saying, no, not today. And so that gives me a lot of hope.
LaTosha Brown, Damon Hewitt, good luck to both of you. It's very good to have you here tonight. Thanks for your time.
Thank you for having us.